Recently, the leaders of France and Germany got together to discuss exactly what the future of Europe is going to look like, particularly in regard to its relation with the United States. Both men identified very similar, albeit parallel, visions. Olaf Scholz of Germany, who is on his way out, envisions a continued partnership and reconciliation with the United States based on long-term friendship, either identifying the Trump administration as an anomaly that will pass and see the United States return to its status quo right after, or rather adapting to this new circumstance and seeing Europe continue to maintain its partnership with the US, but attempting to assert itself more in the relationship. It's certainly a more moderate vision for how things will continue, and it's based on a desire to preserve the status quo as much as possible. However, the reality is that circumstances both within the United States, within Europe, really around the world are changing very quickly. And someone who's very aware of that, who has been aware of this for years and who has spoken about it for years, is France's President Emmanuel Macron. Macron is less idealistic about the situation between the EU and the US. If you've paid attention to what Macron has been speaking about since he took office nearly a decade ago, he continues to echo the sentiment that the United States and Europe have very divergent interests, that inevitably the United States will go in its direction and Europe will go in its own. He said during the recent meeting, the only possible response for Europeans to the period that we are entering is more unity, more ambition, more audacity, and more independence. This is our momentum, and this is the direction in which we are going. It's up to the Europeans and to our two countries to consolidate a united, strong, and sovereign Europe. Very evidently, what Macron is talking about is European federation. He has spoken about this in regards to deeper economic centralization, unified military command, deeper political bonds, achieving a greater degree of European self-sufficiency for the purpose of, quote, strategic autonomy. Macron likely has the more realistic and cautious vision. While not everyone in Trump's administration is on board for pulling out of global peacekeeping, you have some figures and advisors, even the vice president, who are in favor of maintaining some type of presence or observing what's going on in the Middle East, as well as what's going on over in Asia, particularly as it relates to China. But one consistent place that just about everyone in Trump's circle agrees that we need to retreat from is Europe. Even the most hawkish members of Trump's circle agree that the Europeans at minimum need to do more to take care of their own defense. And on average, the Trump administration really just wants to settle peace in Ukraine and then not have to worry about Europe anymore. This isn't one-sided either. It may have been right before or right after the war in Ukraine had broken out when Macron had said that if the United States begins a war with China over Taiwan, that Europe should not be involved. The alliance system between the US and Europe is shaky at best. The Europeans are no longer as vulnerable and dependent upon the United States as they were during the Cold War, and the United States, having defeated the Soviet Union, doesn't have the same strategic interest in the region to keep funding the defense of the European countries. Recognizing these realities, is Europe on track to become a federated union? And if they did, would they actually be able to stand on their own 2 feet? Hello audience, Mr. Z here with another video for you. If you're new to the channel, welcome. We have videos like this every week where we talk about history and politics, so be sure to subscribe, leave us a comment about what you'd like to see next, and stay tuned for more. If you'd like to join the community, we do have a public Discord server linked in the description, along with a community-made subreddit loaded with memes, charts, maps, and more. And of course, if you'd like to help support the channel directly, consider becoming a channel member or donating to us on Patreon. Having dealt with censorship and demonetization in the past, especially when covering more sensitive topics, your support really goes a long way to keeping the channel going. All members do gain access to a separate members-only Discord server where you can speak with me directly. Now, let's get back to our regularly scheduled program. Now, immediately, one thing that might come to mind for many is desirability. Do the European countries actually want to federate? Some years ago, there were of course rumblings about the European Union dissolving. Talks of a Frexit, or an Italexit, or a Dexit, various European countries just leaving the Union. There was certainly for a time pulling in multiple different directions, particularly in a more socially liberal and socially conservative direction for the time being. But even during those times, there was significant support for federation, particularly from these Western countries here. Countries like Poland, Denmark, Hungary, the Czech Republic have always been a bit more on the fence. For Poland, of course, immigration control and social conservatism were big factors driving them to want to maintain their level of autonomy. For Denmark, it's more a matter of economic independence, qualifying to join but choosing to opt out of using the euro. It's important to keep in mind that during this time, the European Union, though there were critiques of it, even the most critical of states, with perhaps the exception of the UK, did see the EU as a benefit to their country. Once again, those Western countries saw the benefits as significant enough to want to integrate with one another even further, whereas others said that if federation were to be adopted, their opinion of the EU would drop significantly. This was before the war in Ukraine, however. Some of you might have heard that Russia's invasion backfired because it only drew the NATO countries closer together. Now, as an American, many Americans were confused by this. If anything, resentment for the NATO countries only increased on the American side. Commitments and donations from the government may have increased during this time, but resoundingly, the American public has grown more anti-NATO across the conflict. So where was this talk of unity coming from? Well, it was primarily occurring within the European countries. This war right there on the continent illustrated the fear that many were talking about for years, the fear of Russian invasion, Russian incursion into the democratic West. Countries like Poland, Finland, and Sweden, who might have been more on the fence about their partnership with the West, were now more than ever determined to build this alliance as a bulwark against the Russians. The conflict also, to a degree, dampened Germany's influence in the EU, demonstrating how dependent it was upon Russian energy. This only helped amplify France's position in the EU as a leader, maintaining a firm stance against Russia and criticizing the US for not contributing more. Ironically, if memory serves, it was the Poles who were criticizing the French as well for not contributing more themselves. But it's clear to see that this conflict has been a unifying force for the European countries, both NATO members and EU members. Even Denmark, who's a bit more sheltered from the situation in Ukraine, it's kind of funny, the US might be what radicalizes them into further integrating with the EU for security. Trump's very bold and brash approach to wanting to annex Greenland is probably a big eye-opener for the Danes, putting into perspective how little influence they actually have on the national scene on their own. The desire for further federation, or at the very least closer unity and consolidation, does exist across all of the European countries. But realistically, what could this bloc of European countries do as a collective? Could they really be a significant power? Well, collectively, the EU has the third highest military budget in the world, far behind the US but neck and neck with China. The real problem for the Europeans is a lack of unified command structure and centralization. So even though they do have a high military budget, this lack of coordination makes Europe's collective military far less effective than either the US or China. If these countries were able to centralize their armies into one single army, they wouldn't just be an economic power, they would be a genuine military superpower. For a long time there's been some diverging defense priorities, but again, the conflict with Russia has put things into a new light and is driving the sense for greater unity and greater coordination with one another. France, of course, likely stands as Europe's most capable military power, which is bolstered by its arsenal of some 300 nuclear weapons and robust nuclear triad, which features nuclear submarines, air-launched missiles, and ground-based systems. Europe's domestic missile defense systems are practical, but limited to regional-level defense, which is sufficient to deter a nearby country like Russia, albeit not against ICBMs. France and Germany have some of the most professional and expertly trained armies on the continent, the Scandinavian countries are well versed in Arctic warfare, and Poland is in the process of modernizing and expanding its military. On top of this, the EU is home to several domestic defense companies such as Airbus Defence and Space, Dassault Aviation, Rheinmetall, and Leonardo to name a few, producing satellites, missiles, aircraft, drones, armored vehicles, naval vessels, and more. On its own, Europe does have the means to become a major military power. It's going to take time, it's going to take a deeper level of organization, it's going to take more investment, but easily the Europeans could get there if they tried. Now economically, there's less question about this. People know that the EU is an economic power, people just feel that it can't really project hard power for the time being. Economically, the EU as a single bloc stands only behind the US and China, standing as a leader in aerospace development, pharmaceutical production, and precise manufacturing. While Europe has a highly educated and skilled workforce, the continent also has a rapidly aging population, and this will need to be addressed if the EU hopes to stay competitive. Advanced levels of infrastructure give the bloc a leg up, but maintenance of said infrastructure is essential, which again comes down to workers. The Europeans have 2, maybe 3 ways of tackling this. The first one is of course immigration, but this is already extremely unpopular. The Europeans are already grappling with the immigration waves they had come in over the past few years. it's just not a very practical option. The alternative is automation, and the Europeans do have the potential to do this. If they are working with a smaller population and a smaller workforce, just have machines do as much of the work as possible. It would take time and it's going to be very costly, but it's still doable. Of course, this type of high-tech investment is going to come at the cost of resources which Europe doesn't really have too much of on the home front. When it comes to rare earth elements, well, they primarily depend upon China for that. When it comes to oil and natural gas, they primarily depend upon Russia and the US for that. Even with some raw materials like nickel, cobalt, and lithium, the Europeans just don't have a big enough supply of that on the home front. They have to usually get it from the US. The Europeans are either going to have to find alternative trade partners or find some other means of acquiring these resources. These resources, mind you, which are going to fuel their self-sufficiency, which are going to fuel them being able to not have to depend on external forces. It's kind of a catch-22. Now, it should be said that while the Europeans do have the capacity to automate, to produce a lot of this high-tech equipment, they do lag behind significantly in AI, quantum computing, and even in the realm of social media. And I bring up social media, of course, because that is very significant to shaping culture and social narratives. When you think about the influence the United States has in Europe, of course, the internet has contributed to that significantly. How much more widespread has the English language become because so many people use and consume American media? If the Europeans are going to be going on their own, and are going to see America as a, perhaps not an enemy power or a hostile power, but a rival power, they might not want to depend upon American social media. They might not want to depend upon American culture and American entertainment. They're going to want to have more of their own legs to stand upon, which they do have these industries insofar as entertainment is concerned. It's just not as well developed as the American industry and is often subsumed by them. So as a little bit of an unexpected thing that Europe will have to tackle, developing its own domestic media presence, not depending so much on American media. And one of the essential things I think worth bringing up is, can the Europeans feed themselves? We heard a lot about how Russia invading Ukraine, which is a bit of a breadbasket, was affecting food supplies and fertilizer supplies and all these things some years ago. Does Europe need American or Ukrainian food supplies to keep itself afloat? Well, fortunately for the Europeans, the EU does produce a surplus of agriculture, namely wheat, barley, corn, as well as dairy products, beef, poultry, and pork. But while it produces enough of this to both feed itself and export some abroad, that comes at a cost. The EU relies heavily on soybean imports to feed its livestock. Without these imports, the EU's meat and dairy production would suffer significantly. Similarly, fertilizers, specifically nitrogen fertilizers, are tied to natural gas production. Phosphate fertilizers as well depend on an abundance of phosphate rocks, of which Europe has few deposits. Now, they could of course import this from friendly countries, but we have to remember that the global economic system that's existed since most of us have been alive has essentially been propped up by the US. In a world where the United States is a rival power to Europe, and perhaps would want to suppress them a little bit, keep them from becoming too big of a threat or too big of a problem, well, the Europeans might not be able to count on friendly trade. One potential solution to this dilemma is that the European powers become imperialist once again. It might seem a little extreme, a bit out there, but in a situation where the Europeans are desperate for resources and they're trying to keep both American and Russian influence not only out of their own countries, but out of their allied countries where they're dependent upon the resources they get there. Now, the Europeans, if they do get their act together, could theoretically just march into a country and take it over. But it's not necessarily in the European style. They would likely go about doing it in a more diplomatic or even just economic way. Think, for instance, the cases of Chinese neocolonialism. But Europe does have another unique approach to this as well. There exists at present a concept known as two-speed Europe. And that's the premise that within the European Union there are some countries that are fast-tracked to further integrate and federate with one another, and then there's another speed of European countries which are less compatible or not yet ready to join the Union at the same level. You could, in theory, create a third speed if we are going to have a proper federation at some point, where you have the countries which are federated, which are part of one state. You have the countries that are in the process of preparing to join that state. And then you have a third speed of countries which are in the economic zone. They receive certain benefits from the Union. They're allowed to use the euro, they benefit from mutual defense. There's a degree of free movement, but maybe not free residence unless it's related to employment. So you have the national security, you have the job opportunity, you have a stronger currency. But these third speed countries, while they're part of the Union, may not be expected to join the Federation. There's a number of possible contenders for this, and one of the most interesting ones are those of South America. Countries like Uruguay, Argentina, Chile, even Brazil, there is an argument to be made that because these countries do have a significant share of European ancestry, majorly influenced by European culture, speak European languages, that there is a case for them to join the EU. If we look at the Human Development Index, Chile, Argentina, and Uruguay all generally rank in the same category as a country like Poland or Romania, whereas Brazil falls into the same category just about of Bulgaria. Okay, but why these countries? What exactly do these countries have that the Europeans might want? Well, Brazil and Argentina especially are major producers of soybeans, which are going to go a long way to feeding European livestock. On top of that, these countries do have strong agricultural economies just from the get-go. They don't need to depend on fertilizers as much as the Europeans might because those countries do have fairly fertile soil as is. These countries are also a good source of lithium and copper, which are going to be essential to tech development in the European states. On top of that, there's the energy question. While not a tremendous amount, there is a good supply of oil and natural gas within these countries. And of course, Brazil is also home to a lot of rare earth elements. Once again, these elements are going to be very essential to tech development, which is going to be basically a backbone for the European labor market once the population starts aging out. Theoretically, you could extend this same principle to, say, Canada, but its close proximity to the United States would probably complicate things. We might say the same thing for South America as well, that it is technically in the US's sphere as denoted by the Monroe Doctrine, but South America is removed just enough from the United States that it might not be that big of an issue, or at least one that the Europeans could have some swing in. But Canada's proximity to the United States makes this a very complicated situation if the US and EU are going to be rivalrous. Now, another option worth exploring, but which might be more difficult to pull off, are the countries of the Maghreb, namely Morocco, Tunisia, Algeria, and Libya. In these countries, you're going to find an abundance of oil, natural gas, and raw materials for fertilizer. Strategically, their position right there across the Mediterranean does put them in a unique place where the United States can't really meddle in their affairs if the Europeans actually try to keep American influence out. The downside, of course, is that there's a much bigger cultural disparity between Europe and the Maghreb than there is between Europe and South America. One might imagine that the Europeans wouldn't be too thrilled about bringing in all these Islamic countries into their union, and likewise, these Islamic countries probably wouldn't be too fond of joining a union with countries who previously colonized them. That being said, the opportunity does exist, albeit it might not be the most practical. Turkey might be of consideration as well, but they're very much moving in their own direction. Whatever future the Europeans have, it seems to be moving divergently from the Turks. And the overlap of interest that existed during the Cold War is gradually fading away. Of course, Ukraine almost certainly is going to become a part of all this. History Legends and I actually put together a video on this exact subject where we outline exactly how we feel the war is going to end in Ukraine, and the conclusion we came to is essentially the Ukrainians are going to lose land, but they're going to join NATO, they're going to join the EU, they're going to integrate with the West, whatever is left of their country is going to become a part of this new union. No matter how you slice it, the Europeans are likely going to see further integration with one another. They're very likely to rise as a greater power in the coming decades, but they are going to face resource issues, and they're going to have to find solutions to that. But those are just my thoughts. Let me know what you think in the comments below, like the video if you enjoyed it, and subscribe for more. Mr. Z, out.